So let's have a talk about language and communication.
When language becomes a problem, it is a real problem. We were talking earlier on about our group for people with dementia before COVID. And we learned from them that memory loss really doesn't upset them anything like as much as the inability to communicate in language. And a lot of people would do this thing of starting a sentence quite confidently and then just run out of words, like running out of road. And this caused them to feel stupid and, humiliated and upset. Whereas if somebody said, I can't remember, everybody would laugh and nobody would really mind. It didn't seem to be, as far as I could see, the big deal. It can become extremely isolating, I think. People find it really, really difficult if language begins to fail.
And I think quite often the family overcompensates for jumping with a word or finishes off a sentence or corrects the word.
Yes, and that's really, that is a really problematic area. I always used to say to people, back when I was doing this 20 years ago, don't ever do that. Don't ever finish a person's sentence. But then over the years, more recently, I thought, well, actually, if people have been married or been partners for a very long time, we do tend to finish each other's sentences for each other. It's just what you do. Or you see a person, one member of the partnership will look to the other when they're fumbling for or they can't remember a date or, So I don't think I would be quite so dogmatic about it but I do remember a lady in Clear Voices many years ago, and her husband would never allow her to. She would stumble and he would jump in with a word. And she said to us once when we were alone without him, she said, I've got this word that I'm trying to remember. And then he comes in with this other word and I've got two words that I'm trying to remember. And it just drives me crazy. And I keep asking him not to, but he won't, he can't. And we asked, do you remember we asked him? But we couldn't seem to convince him.
It's that nuance, isn't it?
Nuance. It's so counterintuitive. It goes against the grain of common sense. Well, it will help you, but it isn't as simple. It just really isn't as simple as that.
And communication as well isn't just about language, and it's about body language as well, and the way we sort of see each other and the non-verbal cues that we pick up as well.
It is. And so our aim is for people to feel safe, isn't it? We want people to feel safe. So we want to try and avoid any situations, either at home or in our groups, whereby people are exposed by the fact that they can't communicate with language. So there are two main, the medical phrase, descriptions for the two main problems are receptive dysphasia. That means the person cannot understand what the other person is saying. So you might not be able to understand what I'm saying. Or it's expressive dysphasia, where I can understand you, but I can't find the words to reply to you. And that is the one that I've had most experience of. Although I have had experience in that same group of a gentleman who was very deaf. And he used to complain that everybody was talking just out of his earshot, and he thought they were talking about him in the flats where he lived. And he did it in the group as well. And I began to think, actually, I don't think this is deafness. I think this is the dementia. I think he's got receptive dysphasia. He can't quite process the language properly. And so it is terribly, it's a terrible handicap. And the interesting thing to me, the amazing thing, is the way people go on trying. Even when they are very, very damaged in this area, they continue.
Still want it. It's like a human need to connect and communicate.
It probably goes back to Kipwood's flower about being included. How do I get included? So we have some tips to help if there is a communication issue. Don't argue with the person. I mean, you may be right. You probably are right, but that's not going to help.
No.
Don't ever confront the person. Don't push it to the point, like with the example I gave of the lady in the shower. Don't push it to that point where the amygdala kicks in. That's the last thing you want. But don't assume that the person's behaviour is due to dementia. This is part of the old culture of dementia care. I remember, to my shame, visiting a couple when I was a social worker. The wife was sitting in the armchair in the corner, sobbing. She sobbed throughout the whole interview. I had gone to help her husband fill in a form. To my shame, I didn't ask him. I didn't question him when he said, it's the dementia. That is not an acceptable answer in the new culture of dementia care. She has dementia, but why is she crying? She is feeling something.
Yes.
And I should have been known better. I shrink to think of the way we were back in the 90s. You know, we didn't know. We do know now better. We know better now, so we should do better. We've already talked. Another big one is don't ignore the person or talk across the person or allow yourself to be sucked into a conversation with somebody else. You know how this might happen with badly trained professionals.
Yes, speaking over the person. Oh, how is your mother?
Yes. How is your mother? Does she take sugar?
Yes.
You know, that thing.
Yes.
And we do know from the feedback we got in Clear Voices how people hate that. They pick up. I remember somebody saying to us, how the look would come over somebody's face.
Right. The shutters would come down.
The shutters would come down and he knew that they were blanking him out. There's the phenomenon of sundowning, which we need to mention. This is to do with the circadian rhythm. Basically, it's the change from day to night. And it appears, and there's been lots of research on this done, I think from the 70s. It's the term sundowning is an American term. It was coined in the States. But it's this phenomenon whereby in care homes, typically after the evening meal, say about 6 o'clock, people begin to get extremely agitated. They may have been as calm as anything all day, and then they get really agitated. They want to leave. They're disturbed. They're frightened. And then I've seen it on the research project I did. People who've been absolutely fine all day suddenly saying, I've got to leave, get me a taxi, I can't afford to stay here, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then later on in the evening, everybody calms down.
What's going on
and
there?
What's going on down there? Well, they reckon it's the day-night rhythm.
Right.
But I have heard Graham Stokes, who's a great expert on behaviour, saying that if you think about what goes on in a normal home, that time, sort of 5 o'clock-ish, is a busy time. Children come in from school, parents come in from work, people go out again. There's a lot of coming and going.
Transition
time. Then, and then there's a period later on when the whole household settles down in front of the TV or goes to their rooms or whatever it is. So he said it may be a combination of both. It could be just a cultural thing, but it certainly is something to be aware of. That, and if it does happen, you'll know why, what it is, and unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about it. To quote Teepa Snow, another thing that's really important is touch, and she says that without permission, touch is not care. You should always ask the person's permission if you're going to help them, even if it's your husband or wife. Do not assume that they're okay with you invading their space, because that leads to lots of difficult situations. Listen, and that means really listen. And how often do we actually really listen to each other when we're in a family situation? Yes. We don't. You know, we go burbling on. Take more time. It's going to take more time. If you think of all the damage in the brain in those different areas we looked at, and you think of the chains of neurons trying to communicate with each other, and half of those are broken, of course the train is slowing down. It's going to take a long time to get there. But don't bother with reasoning. This is only helpful in the early stages. Right. If it's in the later stages, it's actually really negative. It doesn't help at all. Do include them, and in a conversation, don't allow. This is a big issue when family come to visit. The person, I remember a carer telling me how whenever there was a family gathering, her dad, who had Alzheimer's, would go into the kitchen and start washing up.
Right.
And she realised it wasn't something he did normally. She realised he couldn't cope with the family having gathered.
Yes.
So he took himself off because he couldn't process it. And then it made him feel isolated and his emotional needs were not being met. So he just took himself out of the situation. And another thing, mirroring. Sometimes if the person has stopped, said, I'd like to go out, and then what you might try is repeating back to them the last thing they've said, go out.
Yes.
And then that gives them another chance.
Right. Okay.
You're sort of feeding them.
Reinforcing
it, giving them a hand up, as it were, to be able to continue. And I always like to ask people if they can possibly find some time during the day to have a proper conversation, not about what do you want for dinner or what's on telly, but, what sort of a day have you had to really connect, to go back to that picture, to really connect as human to human. Because again, modern life doesn't lend itself to this. Younger people are all on their screens. People can actually be very isolated.
And it can become quite task-driven.
It can. This is the danger, that going back to the flower again, you're stuck on those tasks, not thinking about, so I do think it's a goal, to strive for. Humour is always a great thing. In the research project, there was a lady at one of the homes, and she was a Cockney lady, and I was in Buckinghamshire, and she came. We were initially very worried, those of us who were researchers, that they wouldn't want to talk to us, because they didn't know us. But in fact, it was the reverse. They identified immediately that we were a spare part and therefore available to talk.
Right.
So the minute you went into the foyer of this particular home, but it happened over and over again, this lady would jump up and grab me, and she would tell me a story, and she was laughing her head off. And it was clearly a funny story. And I would be laughing back, and I have no idea what she was talking about. But I felt better for laughing. She felt better for laughing. She then, she went away. She'd done her thing. She was this cheeky Cockney lady, and that was what she did.
And you'd connected.
And we'd connected in a lovely way. Yeah. And it didn't matter that there were no words. It really didn't matter at all. So I learned something from that. And then I'd like to just briefly talk about Stephen Sabat. Do you remember?
Of course, yes.
Okay, so let's just...
Yes. And I think through music for memory, we see that non-verbal communication can play a really valuable part, the way people connect through music, through dance, through rhythm, and find moments of joy together. So communication doesn't have to just be verbal. We can look at all those other ways that we can connect.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I came across the work of Stephen Sabat, only a few years ago, because I mentioned, didn't I, about Dementia Alliance International?
Yes.
Now, this is this group of activist people with dementia, very, very critical of all sorts of things. One of them, Kate Swaffer, coined this phrase, prescribed disengagement.
That's right, yes.
Which is what the doctors tell you to do. Go home and get your affairs in order. That's you done with. That's your life over, basically. But I then noticed that Sabat was on their list on their membership. So I thought he must be an okay guy. So I looked him up and bought a couple of his books, and he's got some really interesting stuff to say about communication. So I'd just like to share with you these 3 slides. The first one, he says we need to take an intentional stance.
Okay.
That is, we have to believe that the person is trying to communicate with us, even if their meaning is not clear. So it's kind of an act of faith, almost, really. This means that they have thoughts, feelings, and beliefs which they want to share. And he's got this very, very provocative quotation. If I do not understand what the person is saying, he or she is not confused, rather I am.
Right.
Because we always talk about the person being confused. But in reality, it isn't. It's us.
Yes, they know what they're trying to say.
They know what they're trying to say, but they can't get it across.
Yes.
But we are the ones that are confused. And I thought, God, that's so interesting. It really makes you think. So then that's stage one. Step two is what he calls active listening. So you need to give the person your full attention, focus completely on them. Do not zone out. We all do this zoning out. All of us do it all the time. Don't zone out. If you don't understand what they're saying, do not say, don't worry, it's all right. Now, I had to change my ways after reading this because I would always have done that. I would have wanted to reassure them, say it doesn't matter, it's no big deal. But he says no. They know there's something wrong. It doesn't help.
No,
to be told that this is nothing, because the right thing to say is, I'm having trouble understanding what you're saying. Could you help me out? You're like, I'm sorry, I don't understand you, and it's my fault. Take the fault, take the blame yourself.
Right.
And then you're in it together. You're not doing, it's this doing with rather than doing to. It's the same thing again. And then he talks about indirect repair as the next stage, in which he says, do not correct the person as a teacher might correct a child. Instead, say something like, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. Let me see if I do. Are you saying that you want to go out? And then the answer would be yes or no.
Right.
So you're a bit further on.
Yes.
Or you could try out the word that they're looking for. It sounds like, you might hear one, you might be right. This tells the person that you're taking them seriously and you're fully engaged with them. And you want it to become what Sabat calls a joint venture.
Right, so you're in it together.
So you're in it together.
Yes.
So back to that picture of the connecting. This is not them struggling alone in this world where everybody has so much to say for themselves and they can't. You're in this together trying to communicate and build something together. And I think that's beautiful.
Yes, that partnership.
It's a really, really lovely partnership. And I think it's something to aim for. It's a counsel of perfection. It's not easy. These are highly skilled things, but I think we can learn how to do it.
Yes, yes.
So really, communication, just to sum up, communication is far more than just language. It's about non-verbal communication, the touch, the sight, the sound, the hearing, smell. It's about body language. It's about facial expressions. And I would just like to tell you a story just to end this section. Years ago, in Music for Memory, there was a gentleman who was looking after his wife, and he came to a course I did, and I think it was weekly. It wasn't through TIBS, it was through another organisation. And he said, I must tell you this. He said, my wife did something amazing. So I said, tell me about it. He said, well, I make bread. And I said, you make bread? He said, here's this guy caring for his wife at home with a very supportive daughter, but he was on his own. How the heck do you have time to make bread? And he said, because actually I love it. And also it gives me something to do with my aggression when I'm furious with her. And anyway, he said, on this particular occasion, he had got his loaf in the oven. It was rising perfectly. He had a glass door, he could see it was rising perfectly. His wife came up behind him and opened the door.
Right.
And the loaf went
Oh,
like that,
no.
and he was furious. But he'd been on the course, so he didn't say a word. He stood there with his back to his wife, didn't say a word, and she came up to him and she said, "What have I done to upset you, darling?"
Ah.
And she
picked up
had
on his
picked
body
up on
language.
his body language.
Mm.
That's all that had happened.
Gosh.
And he wanted to bring it back to the group to discuss what had actually gone on. Isn't it fascinating?
Yes, that's so
It
important.
just
isn't it?
shows
Just
how
shows, yes,
much
yeah.
we really need to take people seriously.